Your mother, my father liked to say, and he always said it with a particular wink, a wink the whole room was warmly invited to share. Your mother could find a rain cloud in any blue sky. Everyone laughed when he said it. I laughed when he said it. It was one of the small, affectionate, well-worn lines that a family keeps in a drawer and takes out at gatherings, and what it meant, what we all understood it to mean, without ever once having to say so, was simple. It meant that my father was the sunshine of our family, and my mother was the weather report that insisted, tediously, on mentioning the rain. I believed that line for 54 years. I believed it at his funeral, which was enormous, and I believed it at hers, which was not. I believed it the way you believe the color of your own front door, not as an opinion, but as a simple fact of the house you live in. I stopped believing it on a Tuesday night this past spring, alone in my mother's empty living room, with a borrowed bedsheet pinned to the wall, and a projector I had not run since childhood, throwing its pale, flickering light across it. It took me 31 reels of my father's home movies to see it. But by the end of them, I understood that my family had spent 50 years handing out two labels, the saint and the difficult one, and that we had, every single one of us, pinned them onto exactly the wrong parent. My name is Anne. I am 54 years old, and I have been a bookkeeper for nearly 30 of those years. I keep the accounts for a handful of small businesses in and around Belfast, Maine, the town where I grew up and never left. It is quiet work, and I am suited to it. A bookkeeper spends her days with one essential task, making the story a person tells about their money line up with what the money actually did. People are often surprised by how far apart those two things can drift. I am not. I have spent 30 years finding the gap between the story and the figures, and I will tell you now, because it matters later, that I never once thought to turn that particular skill on my own family. My mother, Lorraine, died this past February at 81. My father, Bill, had died 15 years before her. And the difference between those two deaths, the difference between the way this town said goodbye to my father and the way it said goodbye to my mother, is, I have come to think, the whole of this story in miniature. So let me set the two of them side by side for you. When my father died, the church was full. It was standing room full, the way it is for a man a town has decided to love. And the eulogies ran long, and they were wonderful, and the word that came up again and again, from the pulpit and the pews and the receiving line, was a word I want you to hold on to. The word was patient. What a patient man! Didn't he bear so much, so gracefully? People said that to my mother's face, at her own husband's funeral. Didn't he bear so much? And she stood there in her dark coat and accepted it, and nodded. And I, 39 years old, and standing beside her, accepted it too. We let the whole town tell us, out loud, that the remarkable thing about my parents' marriage had been my father's patience in enduring my mother. And not one of us, including my mother, said a single word. When my mother died, 15 years later, the church was perhaps a third full. It was a perfectly nice service, but it was the service of a woman the town had filed, long ago, under a particular heading. Difficult, sharp, hard to please. You know how Lorraine was. And a town does not crowd a church for a woman it is filed under that heading. I gave the eulogy myself. I said she was strong, and capable, and devoted. And every word of it was true. And I want to be honest with you. Even then, even standing over my own mother's coffin, I said those words in the slightly careful, slightly bracing tone you use for a difficult person you are determined to be fair to. I eulogized my mother as a chore I was rising to. That is the daughter I was. That is the daughter the family story had made me. It was after that small service that I began clearing her house. And it was in the back of her bedroom closet, behind the winter coats, that I found the box. I should tell you the story as I had it. The official one. The one I carried, unexamined, for 54 years. My father was the fun. I do not know how else to say it, and I do not want to be unfair to the real warmth in it, because the warmth was real. My father was genuinely, enormously fun. He was the man who came home with the surprise. He was the one who declared, on a Tuesday, that we were all going to drive to the coast for ice cream, school night be damned. He built a tree fort, he did voices. He was the father every one of my friends wished they had, and he knew it, and he loved being it. And I want to be precise here, because the loving being it is the hinge of everything I'm about to tell you. My father did not merely enjoy being the beloved one, he needed it. He was a man with a deep, lifelong, bottomless hunger to be the most loved person in any room he stood in, and he had organized his whole life, I now understand, around being fed. And my mother was the break. She was the one who said we could not actually afford the coast tonight. She was the one who said the tree fort needed proper bracing before a child was allowed to climb it. She was the one who remembered that we had already spent the money my father was, at that very moment, cheerfully spending again. She worried out loud. She said no. She kept the lists, and the bills, and the calendar, and the standards. And when you keep all of those things in a household, you become, inevitably, the source of the word no. And a child does not love the source of the word no. A child loves the coast, and the ice cream, and the man who conjured them out of an ordinary Tuesday. So the labels got assigned early, and they were never, ever revisited. My father was the sun. My mother was the rain cloud. He was the saint who had, through some mysterious grace, married a difficult woman, and who bore her difficulty with that famous patience. She was the difficulty that he so admirably bore. My older brother, Greg, believed this completely. Greg worshipped our father, and worships his memory still, and you will hear what that has cost, a little later. I believed it. And here is the part that has been the hardest for me to sit with in these last months. My mother believed it too. Or she had, at the very least, long ago stopped fighting it. By the time I was old enough to take my own readings, my mother had been wearing the label difficult for so many years that she had folded it all the way into herself. She had become a little sharp, a little braced, a little quick to expect the worst. And of course she had. You give a woman a costume to wear every single day for 30 years, and eventually it stops being a costume. It becomes her clothes. There is a particular kind of family folklore I want you to understand, because it is the machinery that this whole thing ran on. Every family that has cast someone as the difficult one keeps a small museum of that person's difficult moments. A handful of stories, polished smooth by retelling, that get produced as evidence whenever the verdict is questioned. We had ours about my mother. The time she would not let us keep the stray dog. The time she refused, in front of company, to let my father remortgage the house for a boat. The time she cried at my cousin's wedding, and everyone agreed afterward that she had somehow made it about herself. Those 3 or 4 stories were trotted out at every family gathering, gently, fondly, as proof. See? That is just Lorraine. And it was only this past spring, decades on, that I finally turned each of those stories over and looked at the back of it, and found, every single time, the very same thing written there. A frightened, sensible woman, being entirely reasonable, inside a house that had long ago agreed to call reason a flaw. I want to tell you one more thing about that family story, because it is the thing that should have warned me and did not. As a bookkeeper, I knew, vaguely, distantly, the way you know a fact that you have quietly decided not to pick up, that the arithmetic of my childhood had never entirely worked. My father had a good job. My mother ran the house with a frugality that bordered on the grim, and yet the money was always, somehow, tight. There were always, somehow, quiet, difficult stretches. My own college had been paid for in a patchwork of loans and scholarships, and attention I could feel in the house, but was never actually shown. A grown woman who balances other people's books for a living might, you would think, have looked at all of that and gently asked herself where, exactly, the money in her childhood home had been going. I never did. I never did, because the family story already had an answer ready, and the answer was my mother. Her worrying, her tightness, her difficulty. The story explained the gap so that I would never go looking inside it. That is what a good family story does. It is not there to be true. It is there to keep you from checking. The box held 31 reels of Super 8 film, and a projector, and a folded square of screen that had long since gone too brittle to use. My father had been the family's filmmaker. Of course he had. The home movies, like everything pleasurable, had been his department. He loved the camera, loved being the genial director of our holidays and birthdays. And after he died, the reels had simply migrated, unwatched, into the back of my mother's closet and stayed there for 15 years. I do not think she ever ran them. I have come to think she could not. I took the box home. I pinned an old bedsheet to my own living room wall because the brittle screen crumbled at the corner when I tried to unfold it, and I cleaned the projector's lens with a cotton ball, and I found that the bulb, miraculously, still lived. And on a Tuesday night this past spring, with a glass of wine I did not drink going warm at my elbow, I threaded the first reel, and I turned out the lamp, and I sat down to visit my parents. The first few reels were exactly, achingly, what you would expect, and for an hour or so I simply wept, the ordinary tears of a newly orphaned woman watching her young parents move and laugh in light. There was my father, vivid and handsome, and 29, mugging for his own camera. There was Greg, gap-toothed. There was a version of me so small that I did not recognize her. There was our old yellow kitchen, our old dog, a Christmas tree from a year I could not place. It was lovely, it was unbearable, and lovely the way these things are. And then, somewhere in the third reel, the bookkeeper in me woke up, the part of me that simply cannot help it. The part of me whose entire profession is the noticing of what is quietly, persistently missing from a picture. Because I had been watching for an hour, and I had been watching my father and Greg and the dog and the small, unrecognizable me, and I had, in all that hour of my mother's home, in all that footage of my mother's holidays and my mother's children, seen my mother for a total of perhaps 40 seconds. And in nearly every one of those 40 seconds, she had not been the subject of the shot at all. She had been at the edge of it. She had been passing through the back of the frame, carrying something. Once I had seen it, I could not unsee it, and I stopped weeping and started, instead, to watch the way I watch a set of books that has begun, very faintly, to smell wrong. I went back. I rethreaded the first reels, and I watched them again. And this time, I watched only for her, for Lorraine. And the pattern that came up out of those 31 reels was so consistent, so total, that by the end of the night I had to keep reminding myself that no one had designed it, that my father had not sat down and plotted to make these films say what they said. He had simply pointed his camera at what he loved to look at, again and again, for 20 years. And a camera pointed, for 20 years, only at what a man loves to look at, turns out to be a confession. It turns out to be the most honest document in the house. Here is what my father loved to look at. He loved to look at himself, being adored. He loved to look at us being delighted by him. And here is what my father's camera, in 20 years and 31 reels, almost never once turned to look at, the person who had made all of that delight possible. My mother was in the kitchen. That is the simplest way to say it. Reel after reel, birthday after Christmas, after summer afternoon. The camera is in the bright room with the cake and the laughing children and the beaming father. And if you watch the doorway, if you watch the edges of the frame, you can see Lorraine, in the other room, working, carrying the platters in, carrying the wreckage back out. She surfaces into the shot for a few seconds at a time, to set something down or to wipe a child's face, and her own face in those moments is not difficult, and it is not sour, and it is not the rain cloud of the family legend. Her face, in those few stolen seconds, is just tired. It is the face of a woman doing the entire labor of a celebration, while, 8 feet away, a man films himself receiving the credit for it. There was a birthday reel, my own 7th, I worked it out, that I had to stop and run 3 times over. It is 4 minutes long. For the first 3.5 of those minutes, it is my father. My father carrying in the cake that he had certainly not baked. My father leading the song. My father crouching down beside me with that camera-ready grin while I blow out the candles. And then, for the last 20 seconds, almost as an afterthought, the camera swings, and there is my mother, at the sink, her back to the room, washing the bowls. She does not know that the lens has found her. And just before the reel runs out, she half turns, and she looks across the kitchen at me, at the birthday girl, and there is on her face the most complete and undefended love that I have ever seen. And not one single person in that room, including the birthday girl herself, was facing the right way to receive it. It went into the camera instead. And then it went into a closet for 40 years. And then there was the reel that I have come to think of as the one that finally broke the dam. It is from a Christmas. I would place it at around 1979. My father, that morning, had given my mother a fur coat. I remember the coat distantly. I remember it being spoken of, for years afterward, as the great romantic gesture of their whole marriage, the proof of how he cherished her. And the reel shows the moment. It shows my mother unwrapping the box and lifting out this extravagant coat. And it shows her face. And her face is not delight. Her face, for one unguarded instant before she remembers the camera, is something much closer to despair because my mother, the bookkeeper of that house, was holding in her two hands the precise dollar amount of a problem she had been losing sleep over for months, transformed now into a thing she could not even refuse. Could not refuse without becoming, in front of her own children, on Christmas morning, the difficult one. He had not bought her a coat. He had bought himself a moment of being the magnificent husband, and he had made her pay for it twice. Once out of the bank account she was exhausting herself to defend, and once again in the currency of having to perform, for the camera, a gratitude she did not feel. But the worst of it, the few seconds of film that I have now watched more times than I want to admit to you, and that finally, at 54 years old, turned me all the way around, was not a grand moment at all. It was a small one, and my father did not know that it was being recorded. He had set the camera down on a sideboard, still running, the way you do, and then forgotten it, and it sat there filming the room at a careless angle for a minute and a half. And in that minute and a half, my mother says something. You cannot hear what. The film has no sound, but you can see that it is something ordinary, something administrative, some small and necessary correction. And my father turns to the room, to his audience of children, and he rolls his eyes. He rolls his eyes at her, hugely, comically, performing his great patience for his laughing children. There she goes, the eye roll says. The rain cloud. Isn't she a trial? And the children laugh, and I am one of the laughing children, and my mother sees all of it. The camera catches her seeing it. It catches the small, practiced, infinitely tired way that she absorbs it, and turns back to her work. That was not a man enduring a difficult wife. That was a man manufacturing one. On film, in front of his children, because a household needs someone to be the difficult one. And he had decided, long ago, that it was never, ever going to be him. I sat in the dark for a long time after that reel ran out, with the projector ticking and the empty take-up spool going around and around, and I did the sum. 54 years. For 54 years, I had carried a story about my parents, and that night, with a bedsheet on my wall, the story finally failed its audit. And once a set of books fails, you do not get to fix only the one entry. You have to go back through the whole ledger, and that is exactly what I did. That spring, night after night. I went back through my entire childhood, line by line, and I reposted every figure into the correct column. The rain cloud in any blue sky. My mother had not been a pessimist. I understood that now with a clarity that was almost physical. My mother had simply been the only adult in our house who was actually looking at the sky. And by the sky, I mean the bank statement, and the second mortgage I would later find documented, neatly and despairingly, in her papers, and the promise my father had made on Monday that would leave no money standing by Friday. She had not been finding rain clouds. She had been a woman at a window, watching a real and gathering storm, and being mocked, gently, affectionately, relentlessly, by every person she loved, for the unforgivable rudeness of mentioning that the storm was there. Her worry had not been a character flaw. It had been a job. It was a job that nobody had volunteered for, and that nobody else in that house would do, and she did it, without thanks, for 40 years, so that the lights would stay on while my father got to be the sunshine. And her sharpness, that little braced edge she had, that quickness to expect disappointment, that was not who my mother was. That was the scar tissue of who she had been made into. You cannot be the only one telling an unwelcome truth in a house full of people who have all agreed to find that truth tiresome for 40 years and come out of it soft. The difficulty that everyone diagnosed in my mother was never her disease. It was her injury. I found her papers, that same spring, in a drawer she had kept locked, and they finished the audit for me. They were not dramatic. They were just the truth, kept in my mother's small, exact hand, a ledger of her own, decades of it, every figure she had been carrying entirely alone. The second mortgage, the loan taken quietly against the life insurance, the Christmas Club account she had emptied, one year, to cover a debt my father had cheerfully forgotten he even owed. She had been the family's accountant in the most literal sense of the word, and she had done it in the dark, and she had done it without ever once being allowed to say out loud, to her own children, that there was anything at all to account for. I sat with those papers for a long time. They were, I realized, simply the written version of the reels, the same story told in numbers instead of in light. Two complete records of my childhood, both of them entirely honest, and both of them hidden away in the back of the same woman's closet. And I had to look at my own part in it, because the reels would not let me look away. I had not been a bystander to the casting of my mother. I had been in the chorus. Every single time I had laughed at one of my father's winking little lines about her. Every time I, as a teenager, and then as a grown woman, had sighed at my mother's worrying, had rolled my own inherited eyes, had treated her care as nagging and her vigilance as negativity and her exhausted realism as a personality defect. Every one of those times, I had been quietly paying my father's bill for him. He had needed someone to be the difficult one so that he could go on being the beloved one, and his children had been more than willing to keep that account current long after he himself was in the ground. I had done it at her funeral. I had stood up and eulogized my own mother in the bracing, fair-minded tone that you reserve for difficult people, and the whole church had understood me perfectly, because the whole church was running the very same broken ledger that I was. I'm a bookkeeper. I have built a 30-year career on a single principle, that the story must always be made to match the figures, and that when the two of them do not match, it is the story that is wrong, and never the figures. And I had lived for 54 years inside the one set of books I had never once had the courage, or the will, or the simple love to audit. I want to stop here, though, and be careful, because it would be very easy, having told you all of this, to let you walk away believing that my father was a monster. He was not. And if I let you believe that he was, I would only be doing to his memory the exact lazy thing my whole family did to my mother's, swapping one cartoon for another, the saint for the villain, and then calling it the truth. My father was not a cruel man. I have searched those reels, and I have searched my own memory, and I do not find cruelty in him, not the deliberate kind. He loved us. The warmth was not faked. The ice cream runs were not a strategy. When he picked me up and spun me around, the joy on both of our faces was entirely real. And that is the thing that makes this so much harder to hold than a simple story about a bad man would be. What my father had was not cruelty. It was a need, a vast, anxious, and finally selfish need to be loved best, to be the one the room turned toward, to be always, by everyone, the good one. And a need like that has to be fed every single day, and it is expensive, and my father could not pay for it himself. So he found a way to put the cost of it onto somebody else. To be the sweet parent, full-time, he required a sour one to stand beside him. To be the generous one, he required someone to be cast as the withholding one. to be forever the sunshine he needed, structurally, permanently, a rain cloud. And rather than do the hard interior work of curbing his own hunger, he simply elected his wife to the role, and then spent 30 years quietly, smilingly, keeping her in office. That is not the crime of a monster. It is a smaller, and a more common, and a more human thing than that. But I have come to believe that it is also, in its own way, a deeper betrayal than a louder cruelty would have been, because it did not look like harm. It looked like charm. It looked, from every angle the town was ever allowed to see, like a wonderful man being patient with a difficult woman. And it ran on, undetected, applauded, for the entire length of my mother's life. And it was still running smoothly at her funeral, 15 years after he was already dead. That is the thing about the quiet betrayals. They do not end when the person does. They keep right on collecting. There was one more reel. I had saved it for last without quite meaning to. It had sat at the very bottom of the box, and its label, written in my mother's handwriting rather than my father's, simply read us, Summer. And when I finally threaded it, late on the last night, I understood within about 10 seconds that I was watching something entirely different from the 30 reels that had come before it. I was watching footage shot by my mother. I do not know the occasion of it. I think my father must simply have handed her the camera, once, carelessly, the way you hand someone your camera, when you would much rather be standing in front of it. And I think my mother had perhaps 4 or 5 minutes of film in her hands, one single time, in 20 years. And so I got to see, on that final reel, what my mother chose to point a camera at, when she was for once the one holding it. She did not point it at herself. It would not even have occurred to her. She had been trained out of that her entire life. And she did not point it at my father. She pointed it at us. At her children. The whole reel, all 4 wobbling minutes of it, is just Greg and me, playing in a yard on some lost summer afternoon. And it is nothing at all like my father's footage, because my father had always filmed us the way you film a performance, and my mother filmed us the way you memorize a face that you are afraid you are going to lose. The camera does not move very much. It just rests on us. It lingers. And about 3 minutes in, it finds me. I'm perhaps 6 years old, crouched down over something in the grass, entirely absorbed, completely unaware of being watched. And it stays on me. It stays, and it stays, far longer than any rule of home movie making would ever tell you to hold a shot. And the holding is the whole point of it. Because in that long, patient, unbroken shot, I could feel, 54 years old, in the dark, in front of a bedsheet. I could feel my mother looking at me, not performing for me, not managing me, looking at me with a tenderness so total and so unguarded that she had needed the cover of a camera even to allow herself to spend it. My father's 30 reels had been the long story of a man who needed to be seen. And my mother's one reel, her 4 stolen minutes, was the story of a woman who had only ever wanted to see. I had spent my whole life believing that I grew up under the warm attention of the parent who loved best. I had it backwards. I had simply grown up facing the wrong way, toward the parent who was performing, and with my back, the entire time, to the one who was actually looking. Both of my parents are gone now, and I want to be honest with you about what that means for a story like this one, because it would be a kind of lie to tidy it. It means that there is no scene of repair. There is no afternoon where I drive over to my mother's house and sit down at her kitchen table and tell her that I finally see it, that I know now she was never the difficult one, that I understand what she carried, and what it cost her, and how unjustly all of us billed her for it. I did not get that scene. I will never get that scene. My mother went into the ground, still wearing the label, and her own daughter had helped to fasten it to the lid. That is mine to carry now, and I do carry it, and no reel of old film is ever going to lift it back off of me. But there was something that I could still do. And I have done it. And I want to tell you about it, because it is the only kind of repair that is left to a person when the other person is already gone. I could stop being the keeper of the lie. I went to see my brother, Greg, who worshipped our father, and who worships his memory still. and I told him what I had seen in the reels, and I asked him to come and watch them with me, and it did not go well. I will be truthful with you about that. Greg did not want the new ledger. He has built 57 years of himself on the foundation of being that wonderful man's son, and I had walked into his living room and asked him to look at a crack running through that foundation, and he was angry, and the conversation was hard, and it is not finished. I do not yet know whether Greg will ever be able to watch those reels the way that I watched them. Some people simply cannot afford the truth about their own childhood, and I have had to make a kind of peace with the possibility that my brother may be one of them. I do not blame Greg, and I want to be careful to say that, because it is part of what the reels themselves taught me. Greg is not refusing the truth out of stubbornness. He is refusing it out of self-preservation, which is a different and a far more forgivable thing. To watch those reels honestly, Greg would have to grieve twice over, once for the father he has lost, and then a second time for the father he only ever thought he had. And grieving the same man twice is a great deal to ask of anyone, and some people decide, not unreasonably, that they simply cannot pay it. So I have decided to leave the box at his door, unlocked, and to stop knocking. The reels will still be true on whatever day he is ready for them, and if he is never ready, then that, too, is a cost of the thing my father built. A brother and a sister, left standing on opposite sides of the same dead man, no longer quite able to reach each other across him. But I told my own children. That was the part that mattered most, and it was the part that I could actually complete. I sat my grown son and my grown daughter down, and I told them the real story of their grandmother. Not the rain cloud woman, not the difficult one, but Lorraine. Lorraine, who stood at the window and watched the real weather and told the truth about it, and was mocked for 40 years for her trouble. I told them what she had carried. I told them what it had cost her, and what my own silence had quietly added to that cost. And I made sure that the version of my mother that travels on now into the future, into the only generations I can still reach, is the true one. It is not enough. I know that it is not enough. But it was the thing that was still in my power, and I have learned, this year, that doing the thing that is still in your power is not nothing, even when it is late, and even when the one person who most deserved it will never know that you did it. I kept the reels, all 31 of my father's, and the single one of my mother's, and I keep them together in the one box, because they are both true and they belong in the same place. A man's 30 reels of needing to be seen, and a woman's single reel of seeing. I do not watch my father's very often anymore, but the last one, my mother's 4 wobbling minutes of summer, I have watched many times, and I will watch it again. I have thought a great deal since that spring about the roles a family hands out. Every family does it. Every family, in sorting itself, seems to need a fun one and a serious one, an easy one and a difficult one, and it pins those labels on early when everyone involved is far too young to vote on the matter. And then, and this is the part that ought to genuinely frighten us, it almost never revisits the casting. The label's just set, like concrete, and everyone goes on to spend the next 50 years living inside roles that were assigned by a child's eye and a charming man's convenience. I'm a bookkeeper, so I will leave you with the truest thing my trade has ever taught me, and it turned out to be the truest thing about my own family as well. In every account, there is someone doing the real reconciling, someone unglamorous, someone who keeps the actual figures, and who says the unwelcome number out loud when everyone else in the room would so much prefer the pleasant story. That person is almost never the one the room is applauding. So if you ever want to know who, in any family, has truly been holding the whole thing together, do not look at whoever is standing in the light, being adored. Look instead, and look very carefully, at the edge of the frame. Look for whoever is carrying something. That is where mine was, the entire time. It only took me 31 reels, and 54 years, and a bedsheet pinned to a wall, to finally turn the camera around. If there is a difficult one in your family, a worrier, a break, a rain cloud, someone everyone has long agreed is simply hard, then this story was for you. One word in the comments, if it found you. Seen. Just that. It is for the parent, or the sister, or the aunt in your family who has spent a lifetime doing the real and thankless work, and who has never once, not properly, been seen doing it. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. Two small pieces of wisdom from this one, before I go. The first, be very careful of the family member that everyone has agreed is the difficult one. Before you accept that label, a label you were almost certainly handed when you were still a child by someone who had a reason to hand it to you, go and look at what that person is actually doing. Look at who keeps the figures, who says the necessary no's, who mentions the gathering storm. You may find that the difficult one in your family is not difficult at all. You may find that they are simply the one who refused, for years, at great personal cost, to stop telling the truth, and that the rest of you called that difficulty because difficulty was a far more comfortable word than truth. The second, if both of the people in a story like this are already gone, and you believe that you have missed your only chance to set it right, you have not entirely. You cannot apologize to the dead, but you can stop carrying their lie forward. You can be the one who refuses to hand the old, wrong labels down to the next generation. Telling the truth about someone, even long after they can no longer hear you tell it, is still a way of loving them. It is late. It is not nothing. The difficult one in a family is so often simply the one who would not stop telling the truth. I'll see you next time.